Here's a screencast to help you a little bit more with how we do remedies for negative and positive externalities, as well as some considerations when goods either are not excludable, in other words, the benefits cannot be contained only to confer to those that pay for them, or the goods are shared in their consumption. And we'll explain a little more what's going on with those in a couple of slides here. First, let's take a look at our negative externality picture. Hopefully this is one you're familiar with, how to set it up. And at the market output, where some basic areas are like consumer surplus, like producer surplus, and like the area of total external cost. That's the amount of nastiness that is borne by other people who are neither the producer nor the consumer. And if you're not familiar with how that graph got set up, then you might check the first part of the screencast for this unit. Right now, what I want to focus on are a couple of ways that we can try to take government action that might eliminate this area of deadweight loss. This is evidence that we're not making the allocatively efficient or socially optimal quantity. As you can see here, the market has underpriced the good and overproduced it. So we've over-allocated resources to the production of this good. We'll examine 5 different things we might consider here, and there's the list of those 5. So the first one, and one that that might have occurred to you because of work we've done in class, is the idea that we could use a per unit tax. And basically the idea is we're going to take this amount right here, the amount of marginal external cost. That's the amount that it costs to make one more unit of a good, but that part of the cost is not borne by the seller. So what we're going to do is say, hey seller, you're going to have to deal with handling that amount of cost. Okay, so we'll call that right now T dollars. We can pop that right over here. So we're going to put a per unit tax in the amount of T dollars. Well, what does this mean? This means right now that the marginal social cost will equal marginal private cost with the tax in place. So we can go ahead and add a label right here. So MSC is now the same as MPC and supply subtax. Well, what does that mean? Normally speaking, we would take that tax and we would draw a new supply curve over there, and then we would find, well, where is the quantity that's sold with the tax? Let's look at supply subtax and demand, and that would tell us it's going to be this quantity. Well, already we know that's a really good thing because that is the socially optimal quantity. Buyers will end up paying PSO as their price. Sellers will end up receiving this price right here, P seller. And the reason why is because that amount, T dollars, the marginal external cost, that's the amount of the tax. So buyers pay PSO. Sellers turn around and give P dollars to the government, and what's left over for them is P seller. Right now, you can probably see this box forming. That is the box that represents the total external cost when we're operating at the socially optimal quantity. It's also the tax revenue box. So in a way, if we could identify the harmed parties, the government could take that tax revenue and alleviate their harm in some fashion. Once we put that tax in place, we'll have this amount of consumer surplus and that amount of producer surplus and no deadweight loss. So that's basically how that tax works. Once again, remember we had this amount of deadweight loss, and so the tax gets rid of it. If there had been no deadweight loss before, this triangle is the amount of deadweight loss the tax would create. All right, so let's move those things out of the way. And now we can think about a different solution. What about a price ceiling? Well, we know price floors and ceilings are represented by horizontal lines because that's how you say, like, here's a price equals $10. We'll put that line at $10, whatever. Okay, so perhaps the more tricky of the two, you can use a price floor or a price ceiling to solve a negative externality. Neither one of them works very well for a positive externality, though. So for a negative externality, you could put a price ceiling here. You're saying that's the legal maximum price. Well, if that's the highest price that sellers can charge, and this is their marginal cost curve that they feel when they make one, what we're doing now is kind of, if you focus on that point, you're saying to sellers, you probably only want to make QSO units because that is the most number of units that you can make that would be cost effective when you can only charge the price ceiling. So it limits down quantity supplied and therefore limits quantity traded in that fashion. Third thing we could do, price floor. How would we do a price floor? We're going to set a price floor up here. And the idea is both a price floor or price ceiling could work. The reason why a price floor can work is because we're going to put the price floor right there at the green line, and now buyers will only want to buy QSO units. So when you note to yourself in your notes or your template for this unit, price ceiling, you want to put that down here, and the reason why is because it limits down QS. Price floor works because it limits quantity demanded. So there's another one there like that. We could then think about how do we do a quantity restriction? What if the government says only this many can be made? Now, there's a couple different ways they could do that. They could have permits issued to producers, and producers could only get a permit. Maybe producers could buy those permits from each other so that the ones who can make it for the cheapest cost end up being the ones that do it. But at any rate, if that's what we do and we say that's now you know the price will end up somewhere between this price and PSO, but it doesn't really matter because really what we're concerned with is the quantity. And we will have gotten rid of that pocket of deadweight loss that exists right there by saying, hey, this is only the number that are legally allowed to be made. The fifth thing on our list is the subject of one of your practice exercises in your homework packet, and that's the idea of the Coase theorem. Now, this will only work, I believe Ronald Coase is the man's name who won the Nobel Prize in Econ for coming up with this idea. But all four of the previous solutions involve the heavy hand of government, where government either charges a tax or dictates to buyers or sellers what they can or can't pay for a good or how many they can produce. And this is one where really we're allowing the market to do as much of the work as possible for us. So if Adam Smith were here and he was thinking about the effects of externalities, he might be the most proud of this solution because it involves the lightest hand of the government. What's the big idea? Really, three things are necessary. The government needs to take action, but only insofar as they need to clarify property rights. In the example you had in your homework, it had to do with a company called Grunge that was dumping sludge into a river, and the whitewater rafting company was the one that was harmed. Well, the big idea here is now the government needs to clarify, and it doesn't matter which way they clarify. They can either clarify that the whitewater rafters have the right to expect a clean river unless they choose not to exercise that right, or they can clarify that Grunge has the right to pollute in the river as long as they choose not to exercise that right. And so that's the first condition, is the government needs to clarify property rights. The second thing is that there has to be a very small number of affected parties. And that example was perfect for it because you had one firm that was affected in a negative fashion and one that was affected in a positive fashion. So the firm that did the harming could pay the other one to not exercise their right. The third idea is that the parties have to be free to negotiate or pay one another. And in that example, the whitewater rafting company kind of had more to lose from a dirty river than Grunge had to gain from a clean river. So they would pay Grunge not to dump in the river, whether Grunge had the right to do it or not. That's a big idea of the Coase theorem. Let's turn our attention now to positive externalities. Hopefully you're familiar with this picture. We have the total amount of external benefit is there because each individual unit confers this much benefit onto a non-buyer, and we're talking about that many units are provided by the market, but it's too few, as you can tell, because it's smaller than QSO, or socially optimal allocatively efficient quantity, leaving us an area of deadweight loss that looks about like that. So we'll remove these out of the way, and we'll start to think about what are some ways that the government could encourage more production so we get from Q market to QSO. And here's our list of a couple of things that maybe we could consider knowing how to do. The first one on the list is a per unit subsidy. So if you're familiar with per unit taxes, that basically takes supply and marginal cost and shifts it up and left. Well, a per unit subsidy is a payment to the supplier for every unit that they produce. So that's going to take supply equals marginal cost and shift it down and to the right. What we want to do is subsidize each unit in exactly the amount of the marginal external benefit. So if we can provide that amount of subsidy, get it so those labels don't overlap too much there. There's the amount of the subsidy that we want to provide. So we try to match that subsidy amount to the marginal external benefit. Another way of thinking about that is that we want supply with the subsidy to cross demand equals marginal private benefit right there at that point, right at QSO. Now the price will be lower, but we're not as concerned about the price as we are about the quantity. What do we know now? Well, buyers are going to pay this amount down here. Maybe I should mark that in there. There we go. Okay. There we got the price buyers will pay down there. Sellers will end up receiving this higher price up here, remember, because the subsidy adds to the payment buyers make. So when I make one and sell one, buyers pay me some, and the government pays me some as well. That's what's going to encourage me to make this many more. That's the amount of total external benefit that people who are non-buyers will receive afterwards. And that's going to encourage an increased amount to be produced in the marketplace. All right. The second one that we might consider here is to provide QSO, the quantity that we think is socially optimal, as a public good and fund it by taxes charged to everyone. Basically what we're saying is this is an important enough good to have in our society that we're going to provide the right amount of it, and then we're going to tax people whether they use it or not. And that's a solution that sometimes works, but it really depends on the type of the good. A third one that I mentioned in class that might be useful to consider is one where the government says everybody has to buy this. That's pretty tricky legally. We have trouble in our legal system by requiring people to do things. It tends to be much easier, given the way our laws are written in our society, to preclude people from doing things. But you just look at the conflict over, hey, people, you have to buy a health insurance policy, and we'll provide some for you at reasonable costs, but everybody has to buy one, and how challenging that was to try to implement, and how much conflict has emerged from that. I think it might be possible, but generally it's easier to say, if you don't buy one of these, then we're going to charge this extra amount in tax. And that ended up being kind of the enforcement mechanism for the duration of the time that the individual mandate was part of the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare. All right, so let's move on a little bit and think about some categories of goods, and this will help us consider goods that are maybe a little bit more or less likely to be subject to externalities. So, two big questions. Can we exclude the benefits of a good from the people that don't pay for one? So if you don't pay for one, is there a way that we can prevent you from gaining the utils associated with consuming the good? And this really is a question that helps drive our stance on whether a good is excludable or not. So if we say no to that question, no, we can't exclude people, then what we have is a non-excludable good. Okay. Probably there's lots of examples of that, but a city park is a pretty good example of that, because if you build the park, it's pretty hard to prevent people from using the park if they don't pay for it. On the other hand, we think about goods that are excludable. It's most of the time, I suppose we could say, well, if you don't pay the ticket to go to the movie, then you can't get into the theater and you can't see the movie. So that's pretty easily excludable. More of a problem existed back at the days of drive-in movies. Well, people could just position themselves in a place where they could see the movie. So how did they make that excludable? Well, if you pay, then you get the little speaker and you can hear the movie too. Nobody really wants to watch a movie without the sound anyway. That's kind of the idea. Can you take goods that are generally excludable and make them non-excludable, or vice versa? Well, sure. I suppose you could build a fence around the park and you can have a guard that sits at the entrance to the park and only lets people in if they can prove that they were one of the people that paid for the park, something like that. You might think about public roads and bridges. Generally speaking, these are non-excludable. In our society, in our town, they certainly are. However, you go other places and there are roads that you can only drive on if you pay the toll, or bridges that you can only go across if you pay the toll. So a toll road or a toll bridge is an example of taking a good that maybe naturally is a non-excludable good and treating it or implementing it in a way that's excludable. Think about market failure. that's our big idea for the unit. Which kinds of goods might be more likely to have positive or negative externalities? Perhaps pause the video for a second and give that a moment of consideration. Assuming you paused it and thought about it a little bit, hopefully you came up with the idea that non-excludable goods are really often closely connected to positive externalities. If we use the example of enjoying the neighbor's flowers, well, it's hard to prevent somebody across the street from enjoying your flowers. I guess you build a big fence around them or something like that. And those are the kinds of things that are associated with positive externalities. Um, Public sculpture, parks, bridges, roads, that kind of thing. A scenic vista parking lot near a highway that goes through a mountain pass might be another example you can think about. Okay, what about the second sort of criteria or way of thinking about goods? And here we'll think about the question, when one person enjoys or consumes a particular unit of a good, can others enjoy that unit as well? And the key to think about here is that we're talking about that unit. We're not talking about sharing it. So this will help us answer the question of whether there is shared consumption or rival consumption. And on the one hand, we could take a bag of potato chips. Okay, of course I could share a bag of potato chips with a friend, but that's not really the idea of shared consumption. For every potato chip I eat, there's one less potato chip that someone else can eat. So this is definitely a thing that's rival in consumption. I can't enjoy this bag of potato chips while you also enjoy this bag of potato chips. If I'm going to actually, I'm thinking of a small bag here that one person would eat all of them. I can't eat this cheeseburger while you also eat this cheeseburger. However, that's different for some other goods. I can sit in a theater and watch a Star Wars movie while you sit in the same theater and watch the same Star Wars movie. And as long as the theater's not packed, that's shared consumption, because you coming into the theater and watching the movie does not deprive me of my experience. The same thing would probably be true with a dog park. When you arrive with your dog, it doesn't diminish my ability to hang out there with my dog. The same thing would certainly be true of an art display. When I go look at that art display, you looking at the art display doesn't diminish my ability to look at it. So basically what we're thinking about here is the good rival in consumption, or is it subject to shared consumption? And hopefully those examples help flesh that out a little bit for you. When we combine these two things, we have two questions, and each of them is binary, and you know me well enough to know that I'm going to think about a Punnett square for that. There are certain categories or combinations of answers to those that make markets do a really good job, and there are certain answers that make markets do a really not so good job at all. So in the upper left-hand corner, we'll think about goods that are rival and excludable, and maybe that's like cheeseburgers. Generally speaking, if we can ensure that the benefit only goes to the person that buys the cheeseburger, and the person that buys the cheeseburger is going to either enjoy it themselves or give it to somebody else, but they can't buy one and have 7 people enjoy it, then for the most part, the market gives us the socially optimal quantity. At the other extreme, where the good is shared in consumption and also not excludable, we have what we call a pure public good. And in those situations, almost always there will be a positive externality, and it would be the type of good that's suitable for government provision that's funded by taxes. So let's think about national defense as a quick example of that. If we have a strong military, then that's going to protect the people that paid for it and the people that didn't pay for it, so it's non-excludable. Also, the strong military protecting me is compatible with the strong military protecting you. The same tank and the same weapons system and the same sonar and radar defense systems and all of that protect you can also protect me. And so it's shared in consumption. So in that situation, if we allowed the private market to determine, we'd get way smaller than the socially optimal quantity. And the big idea is charge everybody, whether they say they want it or not, and provide it by taxes. I should mention a key concept here, which is that for goods that are non-excludable, these are generally subject to what we call the free rider problem, which is I'm going to let somebody else pay for it, and I'm just going to ride on their coattails and enjoy the benefit anyway. Right? Maybe you or somebody you know allow somebody else to pay for the Netflix subscription or the Hulu membership or whatever, and you just kind of use their sign in. And that's the idea of you being a free rider. You're not paying, but you're enjoying the benefits. No judgment, just a economic term. Okay, we have two more quadrants to think about here, and these are a little bit less common in terms of the way that the AP test is written, but they're quite interesting to think about. Excludable but shared consumption goods are things that we might call collective goods. So this might be like a pay-per-view event on television or something like that. You can deny people the ability to watch it if they don't pay for the big fight or the MMA match or whatever things are shown on pay-per-view. But certainly, if I pay for it and I get the big boxing match at my house, that doesn't in any way diminish your ability to enjoy the big boxing match at your house too. Up here in the upper right-hand corner are ones that I think might lead to some of the biggest environmental problems that we have in our society today, which are goods that are rival but non-excludable. So if we think about fish in the ocean is too big for anybody to police or patrol. There's no way we can prevent people from fishing there. But yet every fish that you harvest is a fish that I can't harvest. And these are goods that lead to the economic problem throughout history that's been referred to as the tragedy of the commons. That might even stem from a time when there was sort of a common field in European peasant towns, and everybody would bring their livestock there to graze. But of course, you leave your livestock there to graze a little bit longer than is socially optimal because you want your animals to eat up the grass. And so there ends up being no grass for any animals to eat. At any rate, hopefully that helps you a little bit with public and private goods and with excludability and shared consumption, and also with ways we can use remedies to fix externalities. Thank you.